Hello, welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly podcast, a show for people who are big on cities but short on time. I am Vanessa Quirk. Eric, I know that you're going on vacation next week, and I know that you were originally going to go to Italy, so where are you going to go now?
Oh, it's really exciting. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Turns out I just actually laminated our itinerary, so I can read it to you here. Day one, it turns out we're going to the living room of our own apartment. Really excited. The couch is a heritage site, so I can't wait to see that. Day two, we have an exclusive private tour of the kitchen where we'll get to learn how to make our own meals. It sounds really expensive. I don't know why we splurged for that, but day three, I might even visit the office without working.
Whoa.
But I don't know if we'll have time.
Yeah, I do think that you should try and make it as Italian as possible. You should also just speak in Italian accents and do a lot of hand gestures, and then it'll feel like you're there, Cook a pasta.
Now I wish I hadn't been eating pasta every day for the last 10 weeks. Yes, we'll give you a vacation from your tough week, city lovers, and we'll welcome you to the Sidewalk Weekly podcast. I'm Eric Jaffe. We'll spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing the biggest stories from the urban tech world, and we will chat with housing expert Carol Galante. When time's up on a segment, you'll hear our little bicycle bell.
Ding.
This week, our top stories look at inclusive cities, Main Street regenerators, and whether or not we're ready for online voting.
Okay, let's get started.
All right, our first story is actually a great series of op-eds that came out in the New York Times this week, with special emphasis on the main op-ed from the editorial board, focusing on how we can use the pandemic and the economic crisis that's come with it to revive the city's traditional role as a place for greater opportunity. Vanessa, walk us through this really important conversation.
Yeah, this was a really impressive op-ed from the New York Times this week. A lot of people were talking about it. So one of the kind of central premises of the op-ed from the editorial board is that the city's traditional role has been to provide basic services. And these are the kinds of services that give people a chance to kind of rise up in the world. So these are things like education, transportation, clean water, housing options, things like this, right? And the editorial points out that that's actually stalled in our biggest cities recently. Cities are more segregated than ever between wealthy neighborhoods with no affordable options and low-income neighborhoods. And because of the way that these services and infrastructures are funded, which locally, basically, the quality of the service and infrastructure is dependent on the wealth of the local community, right? So because these neighborhoods are so segregated, low-income populations just aren't getting access to these critical services, or at least not high-quality ones,
The Times points to important work by economist Raj Chetty and others that have been involved in the Equality of Opportunity Project, studying these very issues.
Yeah.
And they have found striking and really troubling disparities between where you are born, right, the zip code and neighborhood you're born in, and your outcomes in life. So things like your earning potential, right? A child born into a high opportunity neighborhood earns hundreds of thousands of dollars more over their lifetime versus a child born into a low opportunity neighborhood. And the same with life expectancy. Children in the higher opportunity areas are living 10 to 20 years longer than in the poorer ones. And there's no other difference between these populations other than the place where they enter the earth. And so it's extremely troubling.
Yeah, there was that companion piece that the New York Times also published this week that had a lot of data visualizations of that. And that was really shocking, showing the disparities between, 27 years of difference sometimes between two different zip codes in the same city. And so the editorial board really focuses in on one potential solution, and a really important one, obviously, from our perspective, which is housing, right? There is this really important quote that I'm going to read now from the piece. They say, "There can be no equality of opportunity in the United States so long as poor children are segregated in poor neighborhoods. And there is only one viable solution: building affordable housing in affluent neighborhoods." So that's a really important point that they really hammer home throughout the editorial, right? But there has been traditionally a lot of resistance to having more density in these types of neighborhoods. Yeah. And it's a resistance that's unfortunately only growing now in the age of COVID, right? So the editorial does say that federal programs could really help here. They could step in with the creation of more affordable housing, that states could step in as well by reforming zoning codes, make it the law that new kinds of dense housing can enter these neighborhoods, right? And that's actually what we're going to talk to Carol Galante later in the episode. So I'm going to pause on that for now.
I mean, this solution of building affordable housing in affluent neighborhoods, I wouldn't call it the only viable solution. It's definitely one. I think it's important not to neglect the reinvestment in low-income communities. I think we read about that. Sometimes it's being overlooked, where you don't want to just move folks into wealthier areas.
Right.
There are lots of communities that kind of want to stay in place, and we should find ways to invest in those areas without displacing the residents of those areas. And so I think that's important as well. I also think what's overlooked here and should be discussed more is the creation of middle-income housing options, right? There was this striking statistic in the piece about the disappearance of mixed-income neighborhoods from 1970, when it was 65% of residents lived in one, to 2009, where it's only 42% of residents living in a place you could call mixed income. And middle income housing is a big part of that, because those households often can't afford to pay market rates, but they also aren't eligible for affordable housing in the traditional sense. So we need other options for these types of households too, to truly get that mix that we're all looking for.
Yeah, and I think to your point and to the point in the editorial, these mixed income areas, they help everyone, right? And I know that we're running short on time, but just to wrap this up, I think, there is this greater kind of societal breakdown happening where wealthy Americans are just disconnected from Americans without wealth, and they're just not incentivized to help them to put their wealth into broader infrastructures or broader societal programs. So I'm just going to end with one quote from the piece, which I think is really important to keep in mind. "The crisis is a reminder that segregation is an illusion. The haves depend on one another. The rich need labor, the poor need capital, and the city needs both."
It definitely does. A really important story here and something to keep in mind.
Definitely. All right, moving on to our next story. This one comes from urban economist Bruce Katz and 3 colleagues of his. And they're writing at the New Localism blog, and they're writing about the need for something they call Main Street regenerators. So these would be people who would help small businesses recover from the COVID economic crisis. So Eric, can you explain how this would work exactly?
Yeah. So, obviously Main Street and small businesses more generally, they have suffered tremendously during this economic turmoil. They were already kind of struggling in many cities before it. And despite the massive federal stimulus and a lot of payments that went to small businesses, they're still reeling. And we've seen all kinds of stories about this. We've discussed it on previous shows,
Yeah,
too.
I mean, we talked about that article in The Atlantic from Derek Thompson that mentioned a survey of several thousand small businesses and found that only 30% expect to be able to survive a lockdown that lasts 4 months.
Right. And so what Bruce Katz and his colleagues are talking about here with this role of a Main Street regenerator is basically a new job, right? Someone who could help revive small businesses up and down a particular street. I don't think they define it in terms of like one neighborhood or one block, but you can imagine the geography there. And they have 5 different functions as they outline this Main Street regenerator. One is to help fill retail vacancies, right, on the ground floor. So work with landlords and businesses to find a connection there.
Right.
One is to kind of help streets remain safe, right? We're going to need to continue social distancing on our streets and our sidewalks, and our streets and sidewalks kind of bleed into a lot of these stores. There's a natural collaboration that needs to happen there. Another is to provide common services, so making sure they all have the cleaning goods and disinfectant supplies and protective gear they need to operate.
Right.
A fourth thing they might be able to do is take over the maintenance fees on common areas that might be particularly hard for small businesses to pay right now on top of their rent. So things like courtyards or common spaces, maybe this regenerator can handle those fees. And the fifth thing is act as a lender, actually, like a direct rent lender. So they might be able to have more leverage to get a loan from banks and then distribute those loans to small businesses as needed on the block or on the street. So a number of different ways this regenerator could help regenerate, really.
It is a really interesting idea, and I'm glad that, Bruce Katz and his colleagues are thinking about this, because it's nice to have some kind of action-oriented pieces to be reading here about, what are potential solutions. Obviously, the biggest question that comes to mind here is, how do we fund this, right? Because as excellent as this sounds, where's the money going to come from for the regenerator to do all these things, right? So in the article, they suggest paying for it with federal support, essentially an additional stimulus for it. The other question that comes to mind with this idea is, who's going to do it? And are there precedents for this kind of action? One thing that comes to mind are business improvement districts, and they have stewards that generally will oversee developments kind of in this way.
Yes, yeah.
Another example that comes to mind is, when I was researching the future of retail for City of the Future, I visited this organization in California called Pop Up Hood, and they do something kind of similar. Their CEO, Sarah Philly, her job is to connect creative entrepreneurs with all the different kinds of resources they need to help them succeed. So that'll be landlords with vacant properties, folks in the municipality who can help with permitting. She'll even provide them, marketing support on social media and things like that. And so I remember asking one of her tenants, this is a great model. Do you think it could scale? And her response was, yeah, if we have a million Sarahs running around doing this. And that is kind of
Right.
what this program would be. It would kind of train and give resources to an army of Sarahs across the nation, right?
And I think Main Street Sarah's is a much better name than Main Street Regenerators, which is a little awkward. Yeah, I think several of the roles that Bruce Katz and folks outline here, sounds like, Sarah Philly and Pop-Up Hood already play. One thing we've been working on at Sidewalk is kind of a digital platform to help retailers connect with each other. That might be to share a space. So if you're a small business with more of a morning clientele, you might be able to find a small business with an evening clientele. You could share the same space and you could pay half the rent. You also might be able to work with landlords through this type of platform to have shorter timelines, so leases that are on the order of months instead of years, things that, really enhance the flexibility and give small businesses a chance to get back on their feet right now.
Right. It's just another tool in their toolbox to kind of get back on their feet.
Yeah. Okay, our final top story of the week comes from Lily Hay Newman, writing in Wired. She's writing about how online voting has a pretty good track record so far, but that doesn't mean it's quite ready for prime time. So Vanessa, tell us about this and tell us which way you're voting on online voting.
Well, I want to vote, yes, we can, but I would be remiss if I didn't explain why a lot of experts are saying that that's not a great idea right now, right? So e-voting has existed for over a decade now, actually. It's been an important option for overseas military personnel, for people with disabilities who might find it challenging to vote in person. And now, of course, COVID is bringing e-voting to center stage right now, given the fact that large gatherings go against public health directives and make voting in person quite difficult, right?
We saw that already a little bit, where it's going to become a much bigger deal in the fall when there's a national election, obviously, right around the time when some are predicting there might be a second wave of outbreaks. So yeah, definitely on the radar here.
Definitely. So Lily Hay Newman looks at an online voting company called Democracy Live, and they've done 1,000 elections in 96 countries since 2008. But security experts are kind of saying that just because you have a good track record and a good history, that is not an indicator for future success. Basically because there are always new and innovative ways that you can get hacked, right? And this is obviously sensitive information. So one potential way that they were saying that you might think you have a safe voting system that could get hacked, for example, is, some folks are saying, oh, well, you could print out the online ballot once it's received, and then there's like a physical record that you could audit later. And that sounds very secure, but then the experts were saying, actually you could change that online record before you even print it, and now there's a discrepancy, and now it doesn't even add up. So those are the kinds of things that you have to think about when you're a security expert, all the ways that things could go wrong. And there's a great quote in the piece from David Kennedy, who's the CEO of a consulting firm called Trusted Sec. And he says, it's possible, but to me, it would be equal of a lift as us going to the moon. So not much confidence from David Kennedy there.
This is a really tricky one, right? We're not security experts,
No.
so we have to take the guidance of security experts. But also, we're at a moment where security expertise even is becoming a little bit of a political issue, right? You have parties who are either for or against online voting, not necessarily because it's feasible or it's secure, but because they think it might give them an advantage in an election. So, I think there's so much that we have to balance and consider now. As I think about this, some of the problem to me seems like that we often have this outsized reaction to really major failures and high profile failures. So you'll remember like the Iowa caucus debacle with a voting app, and obviously the hacking that Russia has been doing into some of our elections. And even though these weren't, e-voting security issues, the way security experts think about it, they raise doubts and fears, right? And so I'm not saying we shouldn't have doubts, but it's the kind of thing where just because you hear about one big high profile thing, you're not necessarily keeping in mind the context of all the other successes that have happened, the 10, 12 years of 1,000 different elections that did go right for democracy live. So I think we have to kind of keep that type of balance in mind as we're weighing the pros and cons here.
Mm-hmm. On the other hand, just to be a bit of a devil's advocate here, I mean, there's also been really big high-profile stories about successful voting systems, and I'm thinking here about Estonia, that's used its iVoting internet voting system for the better part of a decade. And, don't get me wrong, I love Estonia. I think they have an incredible system and a relatively secure system.
Agreed.
But, researchers published a security review that showed, at least at a certain point in its history, a lot of vulnerabilities in that system. So, I mean, they kind of got lucky in that it wasn't exploited too badly. But, these are the kinds of things
that we know
of. But, that was only discovered after the fact. So these are the kinds of things that you do have to keep in mind. And there are pros, especially when it comes to accessibility. I think that's a huge pro, helping elderly folks potentially as well vote, especially during COVID. It's something that we're going to be talking about again. Hopefully we'll be seeing this more, but in a secure way, but we won't know really until the tech proceeds and advances.
Right. And Democracy Live said in the piece that they think 2024 is actually a more realistic timeline than 2020. So even the boosters recognize that there's still a ways to go here.
For sure. Okay, that is it for the top stories. As always, you can find the links to these stories in the podcast episode notes. In our next segment, we are going to talk with Carol Galante. As we mentioned up top, she wrote a great New York Times op-ed this week about why now is the time to embrace housing density in cities. Back in a sec. We are now joined by Carol Galante, a professor of housing and urban policy at UC Berkeley, where she's also director of the Turner Center for Housing Innovation. She's going to talk to us about the key role that housing density will play in making America's economic recovery a more equitable one. Carol, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here.
So one thing that listeners might be wondering is, now is quite a critical moment in our history. A lot's happening in terms of economic uncertainty and the pandemic. So why is now the time for cities to focus in on zoning reform and housing affordability?
I think the reason now is the time is because there has been a lot of progress that's been being made post the last, recession from 2008, because we really got caught off guard when there was a recovery after the 2008 recession in places like the Bay Area and Seattle, Boston. The job growth just skyrocketed, population skyrocketed, and we hadn't kept up with our housing needs across the income spectrum. So you had many, many more people competing for a limited housing stock. So of course prices went up. And so I think now is the time to do the kinds of regulatory reform that people have been working on these past number of years, so that we don't have that situation coming out of whatever period of time we're in terms of recessionary pressures today.
So you mentioned in your Times op-ed a number of cities that are making progress on zoning reform. What are some of the approaches that you find most compelling or maybe most replicable that other cities could look to?
Density doesn't mean 10-story buildings everywhere. Density increases can mean just knitting additional smaller units onto existing, say, single-family lots. And that's what Minneapolis, Portland, Oregon, California to some degree with accessory dwelling units have been starting to do. There's a lot more that can be done there. And I think, getting people to see that type of increase in density is pretty invisible. And so I think that is the most promising. We could really make a difference with that type of growth if it could be embraced by communities. The second, if I could just say, is really focusing more on commercial corridors. And there's so much that can be done along those corridors and in those districts if you allow significantly more residential activity to happen. And I'm not saying get rid of the retail, but, kind of reposition how that retail works within a more residential context.
Obviously, historically, there has been a lot of local resistance to the idea of density, right? And right now, density is in a bit of a bad a place in terms of its reputation due to the pandemic. So as someone who has kind of experience fighting this political battle, what do you think are the strongest tactics or strategies for introducing more density into cities?
So I think first of all is education, and that, density is not overcrowding. I think people confuse the two. If you have quality density where everybody has a housing unit, each household, each family, that is not the problem in terms of the pandemic. The problem in terms of the pandemic is, multiple family members and unrelated people piled into a very small housing unit, people sleeping on floors. I mean, I've seen this throughout my career in lower income neighborhoods. In order to afford the housing, people are crowding together. And that's not good density. Good density is providing enough homes, and apartments for a reasonable size household to live in. And so I think that is, one of the arguments. The other argument, or the other persuasive thing, I think is, and I think technology can help here, is we need to do a much better job of showing people what it can look like. Being able to virtually walk people through neighborhoods, where you've increased density, for example. So I do think that people's visualization of what density is and the reality of what density can be are just not on the same page.
So last one here, Carol, and we'll let you go. We wanted to talk a little bit about a related op-ed that was in the Times this week, specifically focusing on affordable housing and lower income housing. So I'm just wondering, what do you see as the most promising programs when it comes to specifically providing that lower income housing?
Well, I would start by saying, I've spent, a good part of my career actually building and developing dedicated affordable housing. And I think it's really important. I think one of the things coming out of this pandemic that will be a challenge is that state and local governments who have been subsidizing some of the dedicated affordable housing in the absence of a robust federal government initiative are going to be really strapped, financially. And so I do think finding solutions that marry regulatory reform with a commitment to more expansion of affordable housing in these more affluent neighborhoods is probably the key in at least the short term. And, one of those things is, just to go back to density, is, for example, Portland, you get an extra bonus of density if you are dedicating a unit or two. And I'm talking about in these fourplexes going to a sixplex if, you're dedicating two of them to affordability. So things like that, I think, are promising in the short term. At the end of the day, the other thing I would say is we need to lower the cost of developing these new affordable housing units. And there's, modular, there's, lots of techniques that we can and should be employing. So I don't think there's one silver bullet here, to be honest, unless the federal government wants to write a big check.
This is great. Thank you so much,
Thank
Carol.
you, Carol.
Thank you.
It is now time for our final segment, The Last Smile. In this segment, we set aside the depressing news of the week and focus on something happy for a minute each. Eric, what had you smiling this week, apart from your dreams of your home vacation?
Apart from my laminated itinerary,
Yes.
I enjoyed reading this article in the Evening Standard from Ewan Somerville, all about German cafes that are asking their patrons to wear swimming pool noodle hats to help them social distance. So this is just, it's so German here. Hard to describe exactly without the visual, but there's a cafe in Schwerin, Germany, where you can see the folks sitting at brunch, over a romantic meal, and they're wearing big orange, red, blue little floating noodles, the things that people kind of sit on and lay on in a pool to float a little bit.
Yes. I'm familiar with these noodles.
There's a wonderful David Hasselhoff joke about remaking Baywatch with floating noodles on his head here that someone better than I can make. But
Baywatch for the social distancing era. One thing I will say, though, is that you said this was uniquely German, but I have definitely heard of noodles being taken up across the world. I think my parents mentioned they saw a guy with a noodle in their supermarket shopping in Spain.
Really?
And then pre-pandemic, I remember Toronto, I believe, had a pretty famous cyclist who would put a noodle on his bike so that cars would keep their distance. Social distancing for all purposes, the noodle. This segment was not paid for by the noodle companies, by the way.
Or the cafe in Germany, or David Hasselhoff. What are you noodling on this week to make you smile?
Very nice. So I really liked this story from WHYY from a reporter called Catalina Jaramillo. So she was highlighting this really fantastic program in Philly. It lets folks turn streets into playgrounds over the summertime, and it also provides free food to the kids who come to play. And as we know, since the pandemic started shutting down schools, a big concern has been that kids can't access school lunches or playgrounds for that matter. Yeah. And so this kind of program, it could be really helpful this summer. And what I love about this article in particular is all the quotes that Catalina gets from community members. And they're really thinking how can we ask the city to make this program safer and more extensive? And they're saying things like maybe there's this way you could make the permitting easier, or maybe we could connect these streets together. So I just love that creativity. And I hope the city, pays attention to that. And I did want to mention that it sounds like they're looking for volunteers to help. So if you are in Philadelphia, lend a hand. It'll make you smile too, probably.
There you go. Lend a hand, lend a noodle, whatever you've got.
Exactly.
You can use it. All right, folks, time is up. Thanks for joining us this week. And as a reminder, because I will have my fabulous homebound vacation next week, we will be off.
In the meantime, if you want to read the stories that we discussed today and many more, sign up for the Sidewalk Weekly newsletter at sidewalklabs.com.
We should note that the views expressed in the Sidewalk Weekly don't necessarily reflect Sidewalk's company position.
And if you want to send us a voice memo or an email, we'd love to hear it. Email podcast@sidewalklabs.com, and we might just talk about it in a future episode.
The Sidewalk Weekly is produced by Vanessa and me. Vanessa does the editing. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions, and our art is always by the great Tim Cow. We'll see you next time.
In 2 weeks. Bye.